That's the good stuff right here. Hard, soft literature. Yeah. I mean, sort of, kind of. I tell you what, I'll check it out. You know, I'm not normally one to destroy books, but so I'm just kind of big for it. Hi, you folks, Fruit and Noggy here, and I'm here to talk about a compilation of various short stories. It is called Stories in Terror from the Madness from the Borderlands. And I will mention that on the cover it talks about a selling point being that it contains a new novella from Stephen King. This was published, let me double check, back in 2003, so about 16 years old now. And they were looking for various short stories and contributions for a while. So some of these may have come a year or two prior. And I'm just going to read the general summary that they're trying to go for on this compilation. Editors Elizabeth E. and Thomas F. Monteleone have repeatedly transformed the landscape of the modern horror story with their acclaimed Borderlands anthologies. Now, in an indispensable new collection, they present they present 25 all-original tales of terror by today's acclaimed masters and the best new voices in horror fiction, including Stephen King, John Ferris, David Shaw, Whitley Strieber, Dom Piccirilli, Bentley Little, and many others. Shocking and cutting edge, these tales of doom, depravity, and menace will chill your blood and haunt your soul. From fantastic supernatural terrors to the very real horrors waiting outside your own front door, these stories expand the boundaries of fear and madness. And it also mentions that this was originally published as Borderlands 5. And I guess for whatever reason they decided to change the name. I think knowing that this was the 5th in a series would have been nice, just looking at the front cover. And out of these 25 short stories, I would have to say that less than half of them really hit home, were strong and interesting stories in my personal and humble opinion. Excuse me. And I did read their kind of introductory statement, what they were really aiming for, looking for when they were going to publish this compilation. And they really emphasized that they weren't looking for your basic slasher, ghosts, aliens, a Frankenstein monster. They were looking, you know, vampires, ghosts, etc., etc., etc. They were looking for horror stories that were more novel in their idea, a little bit more original. And I find that to be a very ironic thing that they emphasize, because again, looking at some of these short stories, I certainly recognize the general theme or concept that they were telling in their stories, even though they do fall outside of that list of general monsters that you expect out of a horror story. Oh, for instance, I'm trying to think if I can remember which. The Growth of Alan Ashley by Bill Gauthier. That one, to summarize, and I will admit there's going to be some spoilers here, since they're short stories, it's hard to summarize both the story elements and what I disliked without giving away the whole thing. But with The Growth of Alan Ashley, it was a story where basically this individual is so hung up in their fantasy worlds and their imagination and daydreams, where they're going on to be tremendous successes, an incredibly charismatic celebrity, a brilliant writer, director, actor, just the entire package, you know, completely fanciful, kind of a Leonardo da Vinci of the celebrity Hollywood world, if you will. Just somebody who is incredibly fantastic in all that they do. and they're so committed to this fantasy and daydream that they break it up into separate characters and personalities and storylines, and I could only imagine how much of that their time and energy would be spent building all of that up and sticking with it. But basically, as the title suggests, the growth of Alan Ashley, what ends up happening is they develop a zit-like thing that keeps growing and growing, and it turns out to be kind of their alter ego taking over their body. And it's not a doppelganger situation, but the whole body snatch concept as far as horror stories go has been done several times. The idea that our lives, no matter how blasé, how we've kind of shortchanged ourselves, we haven't lived up to our own dreams and expectations, we haven't fulfilled those different hopes and aspirations we've had, it's still our lives. And the idea that some force, perhaps like our shadow or an image in the mirror, who is non-alive, that's inanimate but is still intimately us, would shove us aside. It's like, hey, if you're gonna be a slob and a bum and a loser, I'm just gonna take over. I'm gonna live up to your aspirations, and I'm gonna do it 10 times better than you could ever even imagine. And that's basically what ends up happening. And, I'll give the author a little bit of credit that they did a half-decent job writing the story, but it didn't strike me as original, not even remotely, because I've seen that concept before. It's been done. And, the angle where he was just super caught up in his own daydreams, I guess you could call that a slightly novel angle or touch, but if I had to put money on it, I bet you could find other stories before this one that really touched even on that aspect close enough to be, it's like, they're borrowing pretty heavily there. And I will admit that this compilation had what I have to say is one of the worst short stories I have ever read. It was called The Planting by Bentley Little. And it is such a bizarre idea. It is such a bizarre, strange, absurd concept that I have to give him credit. It is original, but it's also just jaw-droppingly stupid. Basically, what happens in the story is the protagonist steals a pair of panties from a neighbor. No particular reason, they're just compelled to do it. And they basically treat it like a seed that they plant underground out in the forest. And over time, it grows into a human. It grows into a plant and then into a plant person, in essence. And there's no explanation, there's no indication or support for why that would happen, why he was taking the actions he was taking. No attempt to hold it up whatsoever, just following along with absolute nonsense. And then this is smashed together with another idea that isn't really excuse me, it's not connected at all. It's just in the same area. There's excuse me, basically this somewhat ambivalent to describe building because it's incredibly ancient, it looks abandoned, very strange, very bizarre, just seems out of place. And inside of it is basically a mummified monkey that doesn't really do anything, but it freaks everybody out who goes in there and gazes upon it. and there's no explanation. Again, that's kind of the main theme of this short story, is that there's no explanation for anything. And it was just so stupid. And I personally, with the whole concept of the way the building was described, I thought that the author showed some promise. The way they built the setting, described that building, it was pretty interesting. It had a good sense of suspense, but the payoff was absolutely horrendous. And there was no sense of horror to it whatsoever, just befuddlement and scratching your head, and it was truly atrocious. Excuse me. And I will say what's funny too is that the Stephen King novella is treated as this tremendous hook, and you know, that's the selling point. That's sort of the, well, if nothing else, you can read it for the Stephen King story, but kind of dealing with the whole issue of not being incredibly original. It's called Stationary Bike, and in essence, it's really drug out. I think Stephen King is showing signs of his experience and how he can take something that's involving very little action and drag it out with a lot of description and just bog it down. And he has a lot of fluff and padding, I would say, because all that really happens is a guy sets up a stationary bike for exercise. He gets more and more passionate and involved with his hobby. You could say he becomes obsessed with it, and part of his motivator is that he kind of paints a mural that he can look at as he's riding his bike, and then this relates to basically like his internal organs, his internal systems, his hormones, thinking sort of like inside out, if you will, but less emotionally focused, more, oh, what is that movie? Osmosis Jones. That's a little bit close. That's probably a better analogy. And because he's losing all his weight, he's getting into better health, that's throwing off the balance of his system. And I just didn't really get the point. It was, again, this is supposed to be kind of a horror story, but it wasn't. It was just kind of an odd idea, because he was his own worst enemy. It's like, hey, I probably should chill it on riding a stationary bike so much, but I'm just going to keep riding it more and more and more, become more compulsive with this behavior, even though, again, there's not really anything that's supporting it. There wasn't a payoff. There wasn't a, it's like, oh man, I'm experiencing nirvana riding this bike. It was such a lengthy story with little happening and such poor payoff. I just wasn't impressed. I thought it was very flat and uninteresting. And, you know, for the whole, this is the selling point of the book, it was, I thought, kind of a joke. It's about a 42-page story as well, so excuse me. So much for that. I will admit that a couple of the stories, somewhere between 5 and 10, I thought showed promise. They were interesting. They at least fit the description and the introduction of being a horror story that's different, distinct, unique, and, you know, kind of bizarre or strange with a good payoff. And again, other ones were just, I've seen them before. Prisoner 392 by John Merz. I want to say Mertz, but just Merz, no T. Basically, a prisoner is cooped up and he starts having visions of escaping from solitary confinement, and it's all basically a fever dream. Oh, I mean, he's a prisoner, so he's at best would be an anti-hero. So when things don't go the way it's supposed to, or the way he's expecting them to, there's not really a sense of horror, like, oh no, how could this happen to the hero, the protagonist? It's like, well, I support that conclusion. That's just so many of these, a decent number of these stories, just, I felt like I'd seen a facsimile of it before, and it just didn't really compel or interest me. Some of them were so brief, only a few pages, that they weren't really effective at getting to a point at all. Now, one of them, if I can... one or two of them that were a little bit shorter were interesting. Kind of the beginning of an idea, but again, just didn't have much payoff. All Hands by John Platt sort of fell in that category. Basically, every day, certain people throughout the world's hands basically like phantom swap out. So instead of my hands, you know, that I have right now, it's, you know, swapped out with another person's hands. Next day, you know, I just keep getting different hands. So some might be strangely large for my body type, some might be incredibly small or frail, and I mean, it's an idea, but there wasn't much to it. It was just an event that happened with no explanation, some repercussions to it, but again, there just wasn't much point. So I have to admit that this compilation, I felt overall was really a failure. Didn't introduce me to any authors that I felt were just so extraordinary that I have to follow their work, I have to look them up, check them out further. And maybe if I was being more generous, I would say like maybe 2 or 3 would have reached that level, but I just felt like it was such a waste overall that I'm not really that enticed to go further with it. I'm definitely not going to go any further and check out any of the other Borderlands series and compilations that came up before this. This was such a travesty. That maybe is a little bit of an overstatement, but it's just so bad, so bland and boring that it's like, nah, no thanks. And I probably will discuss other short story compilations in the future, but unless I find one that is like truly astonishing looking, something that I've seen has received great praise and reviews, otherwise I'm never gonna buy compilations like these again. I've been too often disappointed by them, and that's kind of my general recommendation to other readers is don't waste your time, don't give it a chance. It sounds like a great idea on paper, but these best of compilations just they don't tend to be the best. But anyways, folks, I've been talking about this compilation too long. I would have to say it falls under the burn it category ultimately. Again, maybe you could say it'd be worth salvaging for a few stories, but I think the other stories are so much of a flop that it'd be worth throwing them out too. They weren't, again, the few that were salvageable weren't that amazing. So anyways, that's my opinion, however much that's worth, but have a good one, folks. See ya.